Hi, everyone. So this is our presentation, the COVID-19 versus the climate crisis. And yeah, let's get started.
So first thing we're going to talk about is the wrong response to COVID-19. It aligns with ecofascism a little bit. We're going to talk about the American response to COVID-19, what COVID-19 is, the American government capability to deal with crisis, as well as its history and dealing with crises. Then we're going to talk about the climate crisis, the current effects we're seeing now, and future effects, as well as the response.
Yeah, and then we're going to talk about how the crises affect people with disabilities. And then we're going to compare the two crises together and talk about solutions that US has compared to other countries, and then what we can do. So here are just some pictures or some opinions of the of people on Twitter, and they're saying that ever since the COVID-19, there's been a lot of changes. And yeah, this is from the Silicon Valley DSA Eco Socialist group, I think. So you should definitely check them out.
So here's a little brief description of COVID-19. The official name, COVID-19, stands for Coronavirus Disease of 2019. It has similar symptoms to the flu, except for the main difference that it is a respiratory illness, making it much more deadly, especially to vulnerable groups. COVID-19 has a lethality rate of 3.4% worldwide, and in some cities up to 4.9%. The US has dealt with viruses with similar lethality rates such as SARS-CoV and Ebola. However, COVID has been proven significantly hard to trace and contain, and as a result, we have seen much higher infection and death. So now we're going to talk about the response to COVID-19. There have been two sides to responding to COVID-19. One side is to aid the people directly affected by COVID-19. This includes providing protective gear for frontline healthcare workers, as well as equipment necessary for COVID-19 patients, such as ventilators to help those people breathe. The other side we have seen is the economic aspect. We have seen the $2 trillion stimulus package that can be broken down into different categories, as you can see on the right. The three biggest categories in order are loans to corporations, loans to small businesses, and lastly, stimulus checks for unemployed people. Another response we've seen is the use of the Defense Production Act, which allows the president to order private industries to produce what the government needs them to produce. Most recently, we saw General Motors being compelled to produce ventilators. I'm going to talk about that a little more on the next slide. So the Defense Production Act is kind of a way of showing how willing the government is to take action during a crisis. Its first case was used during the Korean War, in which the production of steel and mining was increased. It was also used during the Cold War for technological innovation. And in 2011, it was used by Obama to counter foreign cyber espionage by forcing telecommunication companies to hand over information. And it was just very recently used to address the COVID-19 crisis. There are some other major ones, such as during Hurricane Katrina, it was used to produce necessary equipment, and it's also been used during non-wartime for military contracts. My point with all of this is that the Defense Production Act has been used during non-war times to combat domestic crises, and the US government has shown that it has the power in its hands to deal with crises. So next we're going to talk about America's history with crises. The two major ones we're going to focus on is the Spanish flu, a global pandemic similar to the one we see today, although much higher fatality rate. Like this crisis, we saw social distancing practices such as shutting down businesses completely or opening businesses and public transit routes on certain days. The next crisis will be the Great Depression, which saw a national unemployment rate of 24% and in some areas of the country 80%. And President Roosevelt at the time responded with the New Deal. If you have been keeping up with the news, you may have seen that economists are anticipating at the very least a recession, if not another Great Depression as the result of COVID-19. So keep that in mind. And next we have the New Deal. So the New Deal is a series of programs put in place by FDR to fight against the Great Depression. FDR was known to have the 3 R's of his campaign: relief, which saw the foundation of what we now know as Social Security for elderly people or people otherwise unable to work; It also saw the creation of short-time government jobs like the Civilian Conservation Corps to replant forests, then went on to recovery, which mainly included the Work Progress Administration, an administration that created new training and jobs for people during the Depression. The next step was reform, which would attempt to prevent corrupt practices by corporations and banks that got the nation into the crisis in the first place. The New Deal was considered successful as it lowered the national unemployment rate from 24.9% down to 14.3% in 3 years. So of course the question is now, are we in need of a modern New Deal to combat our crisis? So now we're going to move on to the climate crisis. What effects are we already seeing from the climate crisis? First off, we're seeing that low-income communities are hit harder by heat waves that we have seen increasing number and intensity. I'm sure lots of us have had times when we've been trying to get through a hot summer day and dreaded turning on the air conditioner and throwing dollars down the drain. For middle and upper class people, it is a matter of not wanting to spend money. For lower income families, most of the time the answer is I cannot afford to turn on the air conditioner, or maybe I don't have one. So those people continue to suffer more. Children and older adults are also, of course, more susceptible, both struggling to regulate temperature and more vulnerable to air pollution and, of course, natural disasters. And speaking of natural disasters, hurricanes may happen in less frequency as climate change continues. However, they are bigger and create more destruction overall and death. We have also seen increased drought length and severity, which means less water, harder day-to-day life that I'm sure most of us in California are somewhat familiar with. And when you have a drought, you get long periods with no rain. However, that rain does come down in the form of devastating floods that destroy cities. So we all get the worst of both worlds. So next, I'm showing 4 images. On the right, we have a global temperature graph. So as you can see, the temperature has been steadily increasing on average over the past since 1880. The world record for warmest day of the year was in 2014, not that long ago. However, the last time we broke the record for coldest day of the year was all the way in 1911, and we have not broken it since. And here are some images of the climate crisis in action. So here we see a penguin frolicking in grass. And in the top left, that is a picture of Antarctica from the past, next to a picture of Antarctica in the present. And in the bottom left is a picture of coral reefs that were destroyed in just 2 years. So what are some future effects of the climate crisis? This is the general consensus created by the United Nations is that we have 10 years to stop the climate crisis. This is to avoid millions of deaths around the world, to avoid extreme heat, drought, flood, and poverty, something we have already begun to see across the world, such as in Australia, California campfire, and devastating hurricanes. In terms of how long we have to start seriously and aggressively combating climate change, there is no greater need to start than right now. In fact, Drew Shindell, who worked on the Paris Climate Agreement report, says that action must start by 2020. So what has been the American response to the climate crisis? A, by all means, national health crisis, one that has immense death tolls all over the world. So historically, multiple administrations have slowly begun to accept climate change as a threat and begun to lightly enforce regulations. As we saw earlier, the New Deal from FDR included creating government-paid jobs to replant forests. Some other notable marks are the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970 and the US decision to join the Paris Climate Agreement in 2016. However, almost all of this progress has been destroyed in recent years. We have seen the EPA headed by people who directly oppose the goal and ideas of the EPA, such as Scott Pruitt, who as a former attorney general in Oklahoma sued the EPA 14 times, as well as Rex W. Tillerson, the CEO of ExxonMobil, a multi-billion-dollar oil and gas company. And during our current crisis, the EPA's right to enforce regulations has been suspended indefinitely by our president. This is not for medical companies or hospitals. This is for everyone, including oil, gas, and other companies who are not involved in addressing the COVID-19 crisis. So right now, we effectively do not have an EPA at all. That means carbon emissions are going to increase by a whole lot, accelerate climate change, And in terms of the most immediate effects we're going to see, increased air pollution to unhealthy levels during the summer, as gas producers will no longer be required to create summer blends of fuel, and there will be more toxins in the air reaching a dangerous level. So that is the US response to climate change, both in the past as well as within recent years. Yes, you are in the right presentation. So does anyone have any questions before we move on to the next part?
And I think you can type it in the chat or the Q&A box. Okay. So let's move on to how the COVID-19 effect and the climate crisis affect people with disabilities. So the amount of people that have disabilities make up to 10 to 15% of global population, which is quite a lot. And so how does the two crises affect them? Well, for the time and ability, people with disabilities need more time to react and prepare for the changes in the environment, whether it be a special arrangement for medication, being prepared for different types of weather, or just appropriate care in general. All of those things require prior planning and time. And as for ability, they have a reduced ability to receive information. For example, if someone was deaf, a lot of news stations don't have ASL, so it's really hard for them to have reliable news. And some people with disabilities don't have the power or ability to act, and that especially becomes difficult during emergencies, because during emergencies, the situation will turn into every man for themselves, and people may forget their neighbors or friends that can't escape the disaster on their own. And as of right now, I don't think there are any solid protocols to help people with disabilities get away from disasters. Now moving on to the health aspect. So yeah, with these two crises, there's been a decreased food security, so increased malnutrition, and there's been a decrease of clean water and sanitation, therefore bad hygiene. And then natural disasters disproportionately kill people with disabilities. For example, in Hurricane Katrina, nearly half of all deaths from Hurricane Katrina were people over 75 years old, despite being 6% of the population in that area. Most had disabilities. Okay, so now let's go back to the COVID-19 impacts on climate change. So although it's a scary, new, and different time for everyone, people are still finding ways to connect with each other, which is great. There have been social media takeovers, virtual teach-ins like this one, and virtual rallies and strikes, as well as art takeovers. And what I mean by in solidarity, we are united the most, is that because everyone is, stuck at home and quarantined, people can relate to each other and everyone's on the same page, so that everyone's a lot more connected with the community in general. Okay, and then let's go to the pros and cons. So one pro of the COVID-19 is that factories have shut down. This has resulted into cleaner air, less water pollution, and some wildlife is actually returning. So if you look at the right here, there's some waterways in Venice, Italy. If you look in the after picture, if you look at both of the pictures, the water is very different. In the first picture, it's very murky and it's hard to, it's not clean. And then in the second picture, it's very clear and there actually has been fish returning, which is good. And here's the picture of New York, of the pollution there. And last year, as compared to this year, March, there's a huge difference. So yeah. Okay, so with pros, there's also cons. And so the COVID-19 has stalled a lot of US research projects intended for the climate crisis. It's postponed a lot of activities. And actually, the United Nations has postponed this year's International Climate Summit. And it's been held to help developing countries brace for coming climate impacts. So that's something that's very significant. It's also taken attention away from the climate crisis, and every news source that you see, if you go on their headlines, their top headlines are going to be about COVID-19. They're not going to talk about climate crisis. So yeah, it's definitely taken a lot of attention away from the climate change. And here are just some pictures of the air pollution, the before and after the shutdowns. Here is India, LA, and Italy, and you can see that there is a lot of difference in the air quality for each picture. Okay, now let's talk about the similarities and differences between the COVID-19 and the climate crisis. So the COVID-19 is a disease conjured up by a virus, whereas the climate crisis is climate related, and it's mainly because of humans and manufacturing. Yeah, and the COVID-19 rose quickly, whereas the climate crisis, it has been happening over a long period of time. So yeah, those are the differences, and there's a lot of similarities. These two crises are very similar because they impact everyone, whether you're, doesn't matter where you live, your gender, your race, everyone's going to be impacted, or has been and will be impacted. Both of these situations were and are preventable. They both cause trauma, death, and change. And again, they change everything, whether, yeah, you guys are probably all stuck at home, so, and nothing is probably the same. So yeah, it's been changing everything. It also requires countries to work together. Everyone needs to work together to overcome the bigger issue we have coming. It's hard to find cures, and both of these situations are health emergencies. Okay, now that we've talked about them specifically and how they are related, let's talk about how we've reacted. If you're involved with the climate crisis, you probably know or have heard of the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal was proposed in February 2019 and has 3 pillars: to tackle the climate crisis and pollution through a 10-year nationwide mobilization, to create good, high-paying jobs for everyone and ensure economic prosperity for all, and counteract racial, economic, and gender equality. And basically that means to essentially establish a second Bill of Rights and defend everyone. Another thing that the U.S. Has is the Environmental Protection Agency. It's an agency of the United States federal government whose mission is to protect human and environmental health. It's responsible for creating standards and laws promoting the health of individuals in the environment. And then another thing that the U.S. Has been involved with was the Paris Climate Agreement. Yeah, and it's an agreement within the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change and deals with greenhouse gas emission mitigation, adaptation, and finance, and it was signed in 2016. Most of these actions done by the government has been because of communities pushing for it, and so that's great, but the government needs to have a sense and desire of wanting to better the environment on its own. Okay. Now let's talk about other countries and how they're different. So Japan is the first country to honor a new 2020 commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement, and one protocol that they've made was called the Kyoto Protocol, and its main mission was to reduce emissions by 26%. And yeah, and one country that has been tackling climate change hands-on was Ethiopia. They planted 350 million trees in a matter of 12 hours, and it was a world record. So that was really cool. And a country that's currently planning a lot of stuff is France. They're planning the Paris Climate Agreement, and they've also been planning the Energy Transition Bill. It's a bill that replaces nuclear power into reusable hydropower, and it financially compensates families that buy electric or hybrid cars, as well as transitioning small businesses into green power and 100% recyclable plastic. And then, Sweden is actually so good at recycling that it had to import garbage to keep its recycling plants going. And if they keep continuing their great plans, then by the end of 2040, they will have 100% renewable energy, which is really cool. Okay, so what can we learn from everything that we've talked about so far? So there are no borders to global challenges. Everyone needs to work together. We can also learn that prevention is safer and quicker than cure. Taking preventative measures is quicker, cheaper, and safer than creating a cure, which is why we must act now, and which is why the government needs to be prepared. And following that, the government lacks preparation, as seen in the COVID-19 and the panic during the Great Depression in the stock markets. We need to act and execute more efficiently, and by doing that, we need to act and prepare earlier. And then also the coronavirus curve, and I'll talk about that later, but basically it's just flattening the curve of greenhouse gases and carbon emissions, similar to flattening the curve for the COVID-19. No, sorry, I meant the climate crisis. Yeah, the climate crisis curve. Okay. If anything, the COVID-19 is giving us a glimpse of what would happen if we don't act now, which is, yeah, there would be panic and stock market crashes again in the future. So this is the climate crisis curve, similar to the COVID-19 curve. It starts out very low, and then immediately it grows extremely fast. And yeah, this is if we don't do anything now, and if we don't act early, then by the end of these 10 years, the Earth will be too late to save, which is why we must act now, and which is why the government needs to start preparing early. Okay, so what can we do if we're not essentially government officials? So just like flattening the curve for COVID-19, we need to do the same for climate change. So that means reduce energy use, for example, like reduce car use or transfer to a hybrid car, just reduce carbon emissions in general. And then we need to be aware of what's happening. So that means to stay alert and try to spread awareness. So be aware of what's to come and try to spread the message to everyone. We also need to put pressure on politicians and government officials, just like we've seen people do during this crisis, only we need to do it earlier so that we can actually prevent the climate crisis from going to its max. And then we also need to be involved. So that can range anything from gardening or striking, or this is like a stretch, but like trying to stay as involved as you can. Okay, thank you. And these are some resources to further knowledge. And sources? Does anyone have questions? Okay, let's go to our panelist speakers. So yeah, so we're going to have panel speakers, and yeah, I'll let them introduce themselves. Okay, so while everyone's still getting on, do you guys want to introduce yourself real quick? And anyone can speak.
Yeah, so if we can start off with, how about we'll start off with Marisa, and then we can just go in a circle from there. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and why you want to speak here today.
Hi everyone, I'm super excited to be here. My name is Marisa Flores. I go by she, her pronouns. I'm a co-coordinator for Sunrise Rancho Cucamonga, and I'm here today to talk to you guys all about how this is all related and to tell you guys a little bit about what's happening in my area, specifically the Inland Empire. So we are being drastically affected because of our air pollution, but we'll get into that a little bit later.
Okay, thank you. Michelle, would you like to go next?
Unmute myself, sure. My name is Michelle Mashburn. I am a disability rights advocate and activist, as well as a director of a small nonprofit and on the Green Party, Santa Clara County Green Party County Council. I'm grateful to be here today and looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, and then could we have Kylie go next?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Kylie Kirkwood. I go by she, her pronouns, and I am also with Sunrise Rancho Cucamonga. Marissa and I are the hub co-coordinators, but I also am part of the California Youth versus Big Oil statewide coalition, which we just worked on a bunch of social media pushes and webinars for that. So just really excited to be here. Similar to Marissa, just very excited to share with y'all how these two crises are related to what's happening in the Inland Empire.
Okay, and then I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, Ricci.
Hey, yes, it's Ricci Sergienko. I'm with Sunrise LA. I've also been doing a lot of housing advocate activism and organizing recently due to the crisis in Los Angeles. And I think this is going to be a good opportunity to explain the intersectionality of all these issues, climate change, COVID-19, also with the housing, and it's all related. So I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Okay. And then Nassim, Nouri. Nassim, you are muted.
Yeah.
On Zoom.
Okay, that should work.
Yep, that works.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the discussion. Thank you guys for having this great discussion. My name is Nassim Nouri. I'm a council member with the Green Party of Santa Clara County. I'm also an organizer with URGE, Unhoused response group in San Jose. We're creating and distributing COVID response kits to unhoused neighbors in our community in Santa Clara County. I'm a retired medical researcher and a microbiologist. That's why I got specifically involved with this COVID addressing unhoused needs in regarding COVID response. And I'm also working with a number of organizations and nonprofits on global health and education. So I too see the massive cross-section here with the climate crisis, as well as what we're seeing about the response of both our government and public entities to this pandemic. So this is a really excellent discussion to have.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's move on to our second question. Okay, so what was your first exposure to the climate crisis, and what did you think of it?
Anyone is free to answer this question.
Yeah.
I can go ahead and jump in. So I grew up in Rancho Cucamonga, which is a city about an hour east of Los Angeles. And the IE has some of the worst air pollution in the world. We actually, two counties, San Bernardino County and Riverside County, are like the two counties with the most amount of air pollution like in the nation. So growing up, I guess technically my first exposure was just like how many people I knew with asthma. My brother had asthma, but it was never really like framed that way. It was more just like, oh, asthma is something that some kids get, rather than like, we are living in a very, very polluted area. Also, some of my earliest memories sort of related to the climate crisis is just like wildfires. So my earliest memory of that, it was when I was in first grade and like had to evacuate my house because of wildfires. And just pretty much every year since then, we've had wildfires every summer, increased heat, incredibly high winds. So yeah, those were sort of my first experiences with the climate crisis.
And I want to go next because also grew up in Rancho Cucamonga, California. My mom has 4 children. 3 of us, including me, have asthma. And growing up in this area, like this was something that was never talked about. We grew up with smog all around us, covering the mountains. And I feel like there was just a total lack of education on how we were being poisoned basically constantly. Also, like similarly to Kylie, when I've lived in Fontana briefly, when I was like 7 years old. And I remember there was a fire in Rancho, and I just remember ashes just falling all around like our neighborhood from the fires. So and another thing we have like is the increased rain, and just like because we're right next to the mountains, the landslides, the flooding, we don't really have the infrastructure to handle any of the like the disasters that are coming our way and that we've been through. So it's pretty crazy to realize later in life how much like pollution is in my area and how it's affecting like this entire region. So yeah, it was pretty shocking.
Mm-hmm.
I can comment also. For me, I think the climate crisis we're in was a slow and steady change. It wasn't something that was really in my awareness immediately, but in hindsight, I can look back and see it as early as my childhood in northern Michigan, where we'd have one year with a lot of snow, the next year it would be little to no snow, and that variability was an ongoing theme of change because it gradually got warmer and warmer and warmer as well. Since I've lived in California, the climate has changed in huge ways. For me here, the increase in fires, the even more recently this past year, the streams of rain streams that were going on is a new occurrence that is, I think, attributable to climate crisis as well.
Mm-hmm, definitely.
Yeah, it's a very good point. I used to live in Michigan. I remember we would have very intense snowstorms, but I remember also going back very recently to visit, and we had a winter with very little snow.
Mm-hmm.
I'm originally from Massachusetts, but I've been in LA for like 10 years now. I went to school at Compton College in Cal State Dominguez Hills, which is in State Assembly District 64, with like Carson, Watts, North Long Beach, and like where all the in Wilmington. Sorry, that was city I was looking for, Wilmington. And that's where like majority of the oil drilling sites are in Southern California. And so like I had never seen that before, like just driving down the freeway and there is like a huge oil drilling site, and just like really interesting. I didn't really understand it. It was a while ago, and then that starting to see and think about the environmental racism, and then the 7th biggest city in India ran out of water like over a year ago, and just seeing that happen was like, wow, this is the climate crisis is happening right now. Like it's no longer, we're not waiting for it. And then you look at like which communities are going to be impacted the most, and not even communities in the United States, but around the world. And it's just like, it's a very interesting time that we live in, and we're going to put all of this pressure, or attempt to put pressure on politicians to do the right thing, and they're just not doing it. So that's why I got involved with the movement and trying to put pressure on politicians, and it's a uphill battle, but we're we're trying to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Very nice.
So I'll finish us off, I guess. The very first experience I had with extractive industries was in my childhood. I grew up in Iran. But, unlike some of you, I think my first experience was about how an economy of an entire country is built on an extractive industry like oil and gas. And to me, very early on, you could understand the history of a country like Iran and many countries in the Middle East and even South America, where, the world powers literally define how to pillage these resources. So to me, the climate change became, I understand it as a result of actually the devastation of an entire war economy, which is not linear. It's a cycle. It's actually a cycle of capitalism, consumerism, class war, colonization, militarization, and climate devastation. So when you kind of look at this cycle and each component feeding the next, we start to realize that we're not looking at a cause and effect here. We are really looking at a war economy that the entire world economy has been shifted to. And that's where we will find the answer to climate crisis and addressing climate change, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That was a very good speech. So yeah, we've got some really great insights into what the climate crisis means and personal experiences with it. Next question is if there's anything you think we missed in this presentation or anything else you want to talk further about. Yeah. Anyone can go.
I think Ricci touched on it actually beautifully, which is about what is the role, actually, how do we pressure decision makers? I was on the earlier teach-in, which was great, and it was focused on eco-socialism, but the context is actually, transferring to this discussion as well, which is how do we make change? Thinking about personal change and thinking about climate change and what we as communities can do, considering the effects of climate justice, is a very different conversation than holding whole governments accountable, who are literally owned by billionaires and corporations. The corporations that get to pollute in an unlimited manner, right? An entire war industry that is the U.S. military is actually 55th polluter in the world. It's more polluting than 140 other countries. So when we kind of think about what's missing in a discussion about climate change is the accountability of governments and what they owe us in the future generation that we should always talk about while we talk about personal responsibility and what as a community we can do.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good insider view. Yeah, I feel like even though politicians are, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Even though, sorry, even though politicians are always saying, because they kind of have to, but they're always saying they want the future to be the best. They need to actually start taking action. They need to, because it's always easier said than done. So they need to start preparing and actually working for that change. Mm-hmm. So that was a really good point. Anyone else?
I can add that, disability is a reality of life. And there's an ongoing desire to look away from things that make us uncomfortable, whether it's a person with a disability or people that are unhoused or, people that have a different skin color than we do, that we want to, instead of wanting to understand and bridge with that person, we want to control or dominate or just make them go away and make them invisible. So people with disabilities need to be included. It's a concept of universal design that meets people wherever they are, to start incorporating the voices of everybody into the conversations and the dialogue around, climate change, around accessibility, around emergency planning and preparedness. You know, and I think that all of these things share different things with them. And by doing universal design, we meet everybody where they are at, whether they're able-bodied or disabled. Society plans for these things in a way that they plan for able-bodied people all the time, but disabled people get left behind. We're the ones that die because nobody came to rescue us because it was too much work to try to rescue somebody with a disability. So those are, you know, the discomfort needs to be called into the conversation, and we need to say, why are we uncomfortable with this? What have we learned historically that makes us uncomfortable? What have we learned historically about climate change as well? You know, it's like, oh, you know, the framing of the media is totally off compared to what, you know, what is really reality, because, and that's what people swallow and they take home and they take out and put out. So I think it's important that we do some of that bridging work as well.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Michelle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, continue.
No worries. No, I just wanted to share about you know, putting pressure on politicians. So I also wanted to make a point that Nassim made about the U.S. military. You know, think about if we, and I think Christine mentioned it in the chat. You know, think about if we, well, the reason why we're at war in the Middle East is because of oil, right? And we've been there for decades, 3 decades, because of the oil. And so imagine if, you know, we transitioned off of oil and we went to 100% renewable, 100% sustainable energy. It would stop the occupation of all those countries in the Middle East and the killing of brown bodies over there. So I wanted to add that point. But then also to, about putting pressure on politicians, it's like, you know, what great things in this country, like what legislation has been passed, what changes have been made in this country without like a full frontal, like civil disobedience movement behind it. Even from the beginning of time of this country, this country was, you know, started because they wanted to get away from their masters in Europe, and they came here, and then they wanted to break away, and they started a war, and then the Civil War, and then the Civil Rights Movement, women's suffrage movement. All of these movements forced change in this country. And yes, and correct. Sorry, Nassim, I didn't mean to like say it in a positive manner. Yes, they came here to this country and instituted slavery and massacred the natives that lived here. Yes, it's an awful thing, but the point being of like that this country was started as, you know, forms of protest, and it has kept this country alive, and it has kept us progressing to the point of where we started off as a slave-holding country, and we started off as a country where women and Black people didn't have rights, and now we're at to the point where we are now, and you know, all those things are still problems, but like bring this back to the climate movement, like that's the type of urgency we need, and that's the type of movement we need. And because the issue is so large, it's going to impact us all, and it's going to happen quickly. And so I know Sunrise's you know, plan for 2021 is a year of mass civil disobedience, civil unrest, to get millions of people out into the streets and force non-cooperation. And so that's part of why you know, I'm in this, is because I recognize what needs to be done. And so for anyone watching, like we should get to the civil disobedience if you're interested.
Thank you. We'll definitely be sure to.
I wanted to quickly touch on that, and I actually believe that we need both paths, right? We do need electoral power behind us, and we need people who are truly representative of our values, of all of our values, right? And this is the reason I'm a member of the Green Party, because frankly, there is absolutely nothing that keeps any elected officials, once they get in office, to actually follow us, our lead, and insist on human and people-focused policies, because the reason and the path they get there is through donations, through corporate and lobbyist support, right? So when we have a party, the only national party that's actually corporate free, it is grassroots, it won't accept lobbyist donations, is when our mass movements in the streets actually change minds of people, that's electoral power. So we define the Green Party actually as a electoral arm of a people's movement, because without electoral power, we won't get those laws. Let's talk about California. California has, as we have you folks on the panel who've experienced this, 7 out of the 10 most polluted cities in this whole country. California has tons of pipelines. Just 3 weeks ago, California, arguably the most progressive state and the most progressive democratic government in this country, actually issued 24 fracking permits. It was on, fracking permits were paused for 9 months. Why 3 weeks ago, in the midst of a pandemic, were those 24 permits granted? Because no one's looking. Jerry Brown was handing out fracking and pipeline permits, 75-year lifespan of a pipeline. So that's where pressure comes in, right? Civil disobedience changes people's minds. It inspires people to demand more and to not settle for crumbs of a corrupt government. But then what? What's the bust part of that, right? We still need electoral power. We still need a party that's going to challenge these parties of war on Wall Street. And maybe that'll inspire candidates in those parties to believe that they can run corporate free. Right now, those candidates are courted every day and told, you're not going to win against our corporate candidate because we're going to flush them with money. So that's kind of on the electoral side. I think it's something to consider, especially with climate change.
Thank you. Yeah, that's pretty sad and disgusting to see people taking advantage of the pandemic to shove oil and fracking in. Mm-hmm. So we have 2 more questions. We have 2 more questions for specific people. One from Michelle is a little bit more into how the climate crisis affects people with disabilities. I know you talked about it a little bit, but if you have anything else to say.
The climate crisis or COVID-19, because both of them are impacting.
You can talk about either.
Both. Yeah. And anyone can jump in if you, feel free to jump in anytime as well.
Yeah.
Okay, so as I've said, people with disabilities are often left out of the planning process. Universal design begins to start to add people into that process. We currently have in place, California just passed the medical rationing guideline for the triage care, and that includes discriminating against people with disabilities as well as elderly people and anybody who might be considered less valuable because they're not contributing to society. We also have people with disabilities that need ventilators that are their personal ventilators, and those ventilators could be taken from them in a crisis situation according to that triage plan. So these are huge issues to kind of incorporate. Many of the testing sites are not accessible. I was barred from my medical home where I get my medical treatment because that was the space. The wheelchair zone was where they opted to do their testing. And so in order to access the building, I actually had to go through that testing area. It's, as I started this topic here, including people's voices help inform how to go forward. We have people that want to campaign on single-use straws. We have people that campaign that inhalers are bad for the environment. And I'm not saying those things aren't true, but what I am saying is we need people-focused solutions and not necessarily these little things that end up hurting or harming other people.
Michelle, you make a great point about the plastic straws, and I think that a lot of people won't really be hip to the reasoning behind it. Would you mind sharing? I think it'd be very informative.
So straws, not necessarily all plastic, but the plastic straws are the most universally accessible and the most useful. There are some people with disabilities that can't swallow correctly, so they rely on straws for their fluids day in, day out. These straws, if you think, am I going to suck hot liquid up through a stainless steel straw? And will that not burn my mouth and my throat and my lips and everything else? Sadly, the information exchange doesn't go up as easily as it trickles down. So what happens, I know there was a study done of independent living centers in California where people with disabilities were given a choice of 6 or 8 straws. That the findings from that didn't get out into mainstream public, but it was found that yes, there are straws that work for people with disabilities, but then there's other complications that end up happening as well when you use them. And I can define universal design as well for Nassim. But that information doesn't trickle out. So straws are important and vital for some people, just like single-use cups and stuff might be vital to use at a Starbucks or something like that. And it's just an ongoing struggle. I don't know if that clearly answered the straws. I can send a resource to the hosts to hopefully.
Yeah, no, I just, I think that a lot of people hear like no plastic straws is like a good idea and we want to get rid of plastic. But I mean, even when I heard it, I was like, okay, that's interesting. That makes sense. But then, you hear from disabled advocates and that they need a lot of disabled people need straws, that need specific straws when they go to restaurants. And if that's not accessible, then, we're just putting another burden on those people. And so I think it's good for, and to share that information that you said, because I don't think a lot of people really get that because it's not articulated in the manner that you put it.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. Yeah, we definitely need to find solutions that include everyone, include them in the discussion in finding these solutions.
Yeah, I think I read something for the people with disabilities. It was like a slogan that said, nothing about us without us. And that kind of, yeah, that kind of relates back to what I feel like everyone on here has been saying. Politicians are doing a lot that benefits their image, not necessarily the environment and the good of the people in general. So yeah, that's something that we need to put pressure on politicians for.
So for our next question, it's personally for Nassim, but of course, other people are welcome to join the discussion. How do personal measures to defend against climate crisis and or COVID infection compare to the government's role in regulation of industry?
I would love to have that as a discussion. And since we haven't actually heard from Kylie and Marissa much, I would actually love to ask them to take a stab and share what you think first.
Of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start. So I think that there is a lot of talk about what can we as individuals do for the fighting the climate crisis. And I think that there's a flaw within that because the climate crisis is such a structural issue. So like fossil fuel billionaires want to put the pressure on individuals to essentially deflect from like their responsibility. We know that the climate crisis is just as a whole caused by fossil fuel billionaires putting profit over people. But they want to be like, oh no, make sure you recycle, make sure you use, don't use single-use plastic products or all of this stuff just to deflect from that responsibility. So when we're talking about how to solve the climate crisis, it is going to start with pressuring our politicians and just like knocking, taking big money out of politics, just ensuring that fossil fuel billionaires don't continue to pollute our planet and get away with it, simply put. But, not to discredit completely like individual actions. I think, it depends on how much privilege you have. So someone like me, I'm white, I come from a middle class background, I'm college educated. I have more resources and more time to put into you know, like volunteering my time, for example, through my Sunrise Hub. But not everybody has that capability. So I think you also have to be careful when putting so much pressure on individuals, because not everybody has the same amount that they can give. So yeah, I'll pass it to Marissa if she has anything she would like to add.
Yeah, like I can't imagine the burden that a lot of people are like if you're someone who is working paycheck to paycheck, like a majority of people in this country, you have children, you have mental health problems, you have all these things going on. I can't imagine what they think when they're like constantly being told that they need to make sure that they buy green products, or like they have to, like it takes so much time. It takes a lot of time to like to go out and find like ingredients or food that doesn't come from like companies that pollute. Like it's just, I really dislike that for most of my life, I feel like before I became involved in environmental issues, like it was just all about the individual and all about the things that we have to do. And there was never really talk about how our government is just wreaking havoc all over the world, and they have been doing it for a really long time. But hold on, trying to get in the groove of this again. But yeah, it's like I wish that we could all you know, like have reusable plastic water bottles. Like I wish that we could just be given those. I wish that like we could be given, like everyone says, oh, plant a tree, go join a community garden or start a garden. Not everyone can exactly do that. I just wish that like we could all be given the resources to do it, but it's not important. It's not important to our society. So it's yeah, it's pretty frustrating. So I agree with all of that. The plastic straws issues, like I hadn't thought about how that would affect disabled people, and it's just like not something that's talked about at all. Really, like disabilities, people with disabilities, like it's totally absent from a lot of conversations, and same with war, and just how the military industrial complex just, they pollute so much, and they're really so much to blame. So these are missing from the conversation, and I'm really happy that this is a really good panel. Like I'm pumped listening to all of you talk. So yeah, that's what I have to say. I hope I answered the question a little bit. But
yeah, you did.
You definitely answered it.
I wanted to add. Sorry, go ahead, Nassim. I'll follow up.
No.
Okay, I actually really am appreciative to hear that perspective, because what we're doing is taking this journey through what we're told, you know, what we're being asked to consume. We're being asked to consume plastic straws. And if not, we're being asked to consume metal straws. We're being asked to, you know, so the plastic bottle is now been replaced by the 5 or 10 different reusable plastic bottles that people own. So think about even the, you know, nonprofit industrial complex and a lot of advocacy groups that are still pushing us along in this pipeline of consumerism. And that's the defeatist, you know, part of this argument, right? Even the environmentalists are pushing us into consuming more. If we buy any piece of plastics, we are asking for more extraction. All plastic is made of fossil fuels. So when you start to link these things about, do I really need a plastic straw? No, but I show up to a restaurant and they hand it to me, you know? So it starts from having access and having the ability and the flexibility to a sense of entitlement, and not really understanding, do I need that extra thing, right? And the question of privilege is really, really important. Let's say organic food. If you live in Sweden, you're not going to get poison in your food. You're just not. Poor people don't have poison in their food. Rich people don't have poison in their food. You know, but here, the class war structure says if you're poor, you get to take the poison food. If you're poor, you get to live in a, you know, polluted environment. If you're poor, you don't get these services. So it's income inequity that actually defines the quality of life and the longevity of life. There is a very real scientifically proven difference between the lifespan of poor people versus affluent people in this country. And this is very unique to the richest country in the world, so there are a lot of countries that don't have the resources we have. They don't have the clinical or the, economic resources that we have. And they manage to handle inequity so much better. There are a lot of them south of the border of us that do that so much better than we do. And back to why is capitalism has become the tool for human destruction and the planet's destruction, right? And I think that's the conversation to be had when linking all of these effects together. I know we've moved away from COVID versus climate, but think about what, again, you guys talked about Central Valley and the level of pollution that's there. A lot of that is agricultural pollution. It's the poison that farm workers are exposed to every single day. And COVID affects people with respiratory and chronic illnesses at a much worse rate. So those things are related because, to your point, the systemic problem exists among people in this country. There is a class system for healthcare. There's a class system for, pollution. There's a class system for aid and community services, social services. So it's a big conversation, but it's hard to leave any part of it out.
Yeah, and if I could go, and I'm on, there are so many good points that were just made, and I'm developing them in my head right now. But like Kylie was saying earlier, about being like a having a certain amount of privilege and being a white advocate, and so it's on us to uplift marginalized communities, and that's not even to say that it's on us to like speak for those communities. It's on us to highlight those voices of people that are speaking in those communities, and because we don't have the same experiences. And so I can advocate as much as I can and have passion for it, but it's not the same. And so I wanted to add that point to Kylie, and then I wanted to make a point about that Nassim made about, what our country spends money on. This country subsidizes the fossil fuel industry. We give them billions and billions of dollars to corporations, and it doesn't have to be that way. We can take that money and spend it on green renewable sources. We spend billions for oil and to keep us at war and all of this stuff. It doesn't have to be that way, though. The reason why it is that way is because, as alluded to, they're paid for. Politicians are paid for by these corporations and by these billionaires. So of course, the people that are funding those campaigns, you're not going to then turn around and vote against their wishes. That's not what happens. And that happens on a local level, on a state level, on a federal level. Like we deal with that same stuff in LA. Like there are city council members that take money from the gas company, and that's why we don't move towards a green energy system in LA. And then to a final point that that about COVID and the climate crisis, you've seen, I'm sure plenty of people here have seen the articles that have been written about Black and brown communities that are experiencing higher rates of death and infections due to COVID-19. And then you realize that environmental racism has led to communities of color having higher proportion of cancer, asthma, things that were mentioned previously. And then COVID-19 is something that attacks the respiratory system. And so we have put so much pressure and stress on these communities with the way that the system is set up. And then of course, when a crisis happens, those same communities are hit much, much harder because we place them in that situation. The system, for everyone here, I'm sure understands, the system is working perfectly as it's designed, as it's planned, as those people in power have planned it. And so this is exactly how it's supposed to go. And so it's like, the COVID-19 crisis is a serious issue, but it also highlights an issue that I think all of us on here are fighting for with environmental injustice and environmental racism. And so it just shows how intersectional all of these things truly are. And that's why we need a just transition, and we need to take care of workers. We need to take care of frontline communities. And then that's what the Green New Deal is all about.
Thank you, all of you, for you guys' insight. We're gonna have one last very short question. This is something we had trouble finding information on. Maybe it's because there isn't that much of it, but do you know of any solutions that the US has taken so far to flatten the curve of climate change?
I don't think there really has been anything. We had the Paris Climate Accord, but that was a half measure, and we've only gotten worse. So
yeah, and we're no longer in it either.
No longer in it.
I mean, I do want to highlight that although like President Obama isn't all that we wish for, and there are some things that we wish he had done better, but he did pass the Clean Water Act or Clean Water Rule, and you know, he did encourage investments for like solar energy and renewable energy sources, though not at the scale and the level that we wanted. But then this asshole came into office and undid everything, any positive thing that President Obama did. So like we wish he would have done more, but then this guy came in and got rid of all of the positive stuff that Obama did. So it's like we face a much bigger uphill battle now because of him.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I want to suggest again that because we need an electoral path, we need representatives that actually care about what we need, what the people need, rather than what their billionaire owners want from them. One of the best things that we can advocate for, and I know Ricci talked about getting in the streets and, you know, having civil disobedience. One of the most important things we need is electoral reform. We will not have a government that we need and we deserve. We will not have representation as long as we're actually ruled and threatened, you know, when we try to vote our values. Every single one of you has demonstrated that you have the values of a Green Party member, but the duopoly won't allow you to actually vote your values because we operate on a system of fear. The American people for the past 50 years have voted against somebody that they don't want. And every election cycle, you're going to hear this, right? Fear-mongering and vote shaming do not result in democracy. They never have, they never will. And the problem is when there is a populist candidate that inspires people and people find something that they want to vote for, what do the corporatist duopolies do? They will marginalize them, they will demonize them, and they will take them out of the system, just like they've done with Bernie Sanders. If it wasn't enough to see it in 2016 when I campaigned for him, it sure as hell is enough to see it again happen in 22. So this is the dilemma of not having fair, democratic, representative election systems like ranked choice voting, like proportional representation, like systems that take away the argument that the duopoly really loves to throw at us, which is you have to vote for the lesser of two evils. You know, the problem is this is the evil of the lesser, right? There is no lesser. We will not we will not have our planet. We will not have a future for our children because this has been a race to the bottom. And every election you will hear it. Oh my gosh, not this election. Vote your values next election. But this election, we got to vote against that guy, that monster, right? And it serves them both. If the Democratic Party really wanted to serve against the monster, wanted to inspire people to vote against the monster, 2016, they had a very decent candidate that they could have supported. So think about that trap that we're in, right? Literally, the American voters are being taken hostage by the two major corporate-owned parties. So one of the things that I believe in is that you can't change that monster from within. And that's been proven for the past 30, 40 years, actually. Bernie isn't the first, progressive that tried to change the Democratic Party. There were, long before him was the Rainbow Coalition, was Jesse Jackson. After that, Dennis Kucinich, after that, it was Howard Dean, so the progressives, literally go to the Democratic Party to change it, bring all this amazing energy and demands for a better life, for better policies, and they kind of just kill it. They die within the Democratic Party because they cannot let go of their source of funding. So electoral reform will change that. It doesn't matter. The Democrats and the Republicans wouldn't be able to use the lesser of two evil if we had ranked choice voting. And they will be pushed for better policies, They would have supported Bernie Sanders probably if we had ranked choice voting because they knew he would win. So that's kind of my end to what also Ricci has said and what we can do on a personal level. How does our effort towards climate change and for addressing pandemics, what can we do personally? We can demand more from our government. I think that's the most powerful message we can take. And to be very clear, Marissa's point is all of us who have the privilege should demand that on behalf of everybody who may not have that privilege, because until the day comes that we have equitable societies where everyone has the time to go plant a tree, when everyone has the time to go, cook for themselves and spend time with their family, when we have livable wages, then our movements have to be, fighting for everybody.
Thank you so much. So we're gonna wrap it up about right now. I'll give everyone else about if you have any last remarks, you can try and include it, but please try and limit it to about 30 seconds or so. And then that will be the end.
I have a quick one. I challenge the activists that are working on climate change to make sure that all voices are heard. And if you don't hear a voice within your platforms, including the Green New Deal, what voices do you need to reach out to fill that empty slot?
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say that let's make civil disobedience the new normal, and let's have a year of non-cooperation in 2021 and get people out in the streets. I forget who mentioned earlier, 3.5 million people to organize and get out in the streets and force these politicians to do the right thing and realize that all these issues are intersectional.
Okay, thank you. Any other last remarks?
I totally agree with civil disobedience. Like, we have to agitate and be hella annoying, like, because there are so many people who are suffering right now, and we need, if you are able to, because I mean, being civil, sometimes going out in the streets that's a privilege. You need to be the voice for those who cannot, who are being totally screwed over right now, and who have been screwed over for a really long time. So yeah,
Definitely.
Okay, thank you all for coming. We're gonna end the webinar about right here. It was really great talking to all of you. And let's go ahead and give a shout out to all of our panelists for taking time to be here today and talk with us.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome panel. Thank you so much to you all. Great ideas and thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
very radical.
Organizing, guys.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you to everyone who attended. Sign up for tomorrow's webinars at the California Youth Climate Strike website. And then, yeah, go check out these panelists. Let me share a screen real quick so that, yeah. So, okay, thank you, everyone. You guys can all go.
Thank you.